So in our previous rendition, we talked about how master and slave morality could be represented as the nerds and the jocks. Now what we're going to do is explore how this manifests in Western culture as a whole. Now before we get into this, I want to announce that I've experienced the slave revolt. You may notice that my nose is a little bit sniffly. This is something you're going to have to deal with. There was a slave revolt of microorganisms within my body, like the French Revolution. They assaulted my immune system, my noble hierarchical immune system, which categorizes everything and decides what is botched and degenerate and lowly, and it has taken that on. But they did not get the upper hand. I have quashed the slave revolt. I've overcome it, I'm on the better end, and now we shall record. But there will be a slight tone. I've been scarred by this slave revolt. It has left its impression upon me, the trauma upon me. Soon I will be back to strength. But this is what we're going to have to deal with for now. Now, when we were talking about the nerd and the jock, we were doing a comparison. We were comparing two perspectives. Now, you could make a film, an American Pie film, a high school drama, which would show both of these perspectives interacting with each other. This is the incredible power of mankind, our ability to get out of our own heads and look down on many different people and think about what their realities are like. This is the skill, empathy, I guess you could call it, that you need to develop. A very creative skill if you really want to understand these things. The problem, of course, with people these days is that they're egotistical. They are not able to perceive and empathize and see things from different perspectives because their brains are very small. But we are not like that. We have massive, juicy brains. We are, I guess, masters. We are the conquering supermen. So our brains are so full of jelly that we're able to imagine entirely other perspectives, put ourselves in other people's shoes and see their realities. Now, of course, you probably think that empathizing, that seeing things from other people's perspectives is all about sitting down and thinking about people who got hurt, thinking about people who are victims, thinking about poor homeless people and stuff like this. Of course, that is one thing you can do. But because you think about that, because you default to empathizing with them, says, where my hands go, says an awful lot about your culture. Why do you default into trying to see the perspective of the victim? If you were watching this film, why would you default to trying to see the perspective of the nerd and not try to sympathize or understand or value the perspective of the jock? What is going on there? So let's talk about storytelling in movies in general. When you are trying to make a movie, you obviously have to have a hero. You have to have a hero and you need a villain. That's what people say. Maybe you don't need that stuff. Who made that stuff up? I don't know. But generally speaking, you're going to have a protagonist and you're going to have an antagonist, a hero and a villain. Now, you're going to generally see the film out of the eyes of the hero. Now, some more advanced films written by Irish people, for example, they will actually show you the film through the eyes of the villain as well. So you will see through both. You will see both the villain and the hero. But generally speaking, you're going to sympathize with the protagonist. You are going to be shown parts of the protagonist's life that make you bond with him. For example, if you see the villain, you might see him planning a murder or something like this, or being really, really evil. But you're probably not going to get this comprehensive vision of his backstory to help you empathize with the trauma that he went through in his childhood and that turned him into what he is. You're not really going to see that stuff. Because if you start to sympathize with the villain too much, you might actually start to see him as maybe an anti-hero or a hero in his own way or something like this. So generally speaking, if I'm trying to set up a film, I'm trying to make you sympathetic. This is the technical term, sympathetic to the hero. I want you to bond with the hero, and I want you to see the hero as fighting for what is right, and I want you to align with the hero's values. So I'll show you the hero's story, I'll show you his childhood, I'll show you the things he cared about, so that's his values. I'll show you his perspective, and you'll align with his values in his perspective. Now, this is very important. Now let's think about who tends to be the hero in our stories in Western culture. Now, this is not always the case, but it is usually the case. What type of perspective are we getting presented? Let's take, for example, Transformers with Megan Fox. The perspective we are experiencing that film through is the nerd, that's Shia LaBeouf. And of course, the jock is the villain. He's the bad guy, the guy who we don't align with, we don't sympathize with. He's just a dick. He's just nasty and he's just mean. He, of course, has Megan. He's the blonde athlete who's cool and has the car and all this stuff. But the nerd wins. The nerd is the guy that we care about, and he becomes the hero and protagonist of the story. We're seeing the whole story through the eyes of this underling guy, of the nerd who overcomes a situation and wins. That's very interesting. We assume that the jock is the archetype of something negative, and this is saturated throughout an awful lot of Hollywood movies. Now, when we find ourselves looking at the world the way that Shia LaBeouf sees it, and we find ourselves sympathizing with this hero and aligning with his perspectives and the values that he has about the world, we start to think a certain way. We start to see this stuff in ourselves. What the jock represents becomes a symbol of something negative, of something bad. The jock, as we said in our last video, is obviously an expression of health, of good genetics, of good breeding, of confidence, of athletic prowess, of natural, effortless confidence. He's funny, he's cool. And there's a reason why he's high status. He's probably actually got a good character in many ways. But instead, because we're experiencing this from the perspective of the nerd, we make all these assumptions about the jock. We assume that he's mean-spirited, that he's just a bully and a dick, that he's nasty, he's uncaring, he is arrogant, he is uptight, he's upper class, he's got these various things that make him just a bad guy overall. He's got a bad heart. He's like Draco Malfoy in Harry Potter is a very, very similar thing. And this framing, this demonization of the jock leads to us to develop a set of assumptions. So something quite dangerous can happen as a consequence of this. We can throw the baby out with the bathwater by us identifying with Shia LaBeouf, like the underdog, like the nerd, the loser, the guy who's uncool. Us obviously sympathizing with him because he does have an interesting story. Us seeing things from his eyes. Us invoking that act of profound empathy that we have. We end up seeing this jock as a villain, painting a picture, a story inside of our head that the nerd experiences of this jock as a villain, and then associating all the traits that the jock has as bad, as evil. We start to assume that people who are genetically well-bred are bad for some reason. We have to rationalize why that's a bad trait because the jock has it. The nerd doesn't. Somebody who is popular, and hasn't ever had to go through some type of like social struggle or something like this. We have to assume that this is bad. He's popular because he's mean, he's a bully. Nobody gets popular unless they become a bully. Or something like this. He's unthinking. All these types of things. Negatively toned traits. And what you see is this rationalization, this set of ideas, this set of perspectives that force us to demoralize things like health, genetics, beauty, being cool, being naturally healthy. All the things that the jock possesses, the master would possess. Now, you might say, Steph, this is quite pedantic or maybe even trivial. Or in some sense, Steph, you're just pointing out the obvious. Like, what do you mean by this? But if you compare this to the way that people in the West thought maybe 200 years ago, you'll start to realize how wacky this is. So take, for example, the idea that if you came from money, you're sort of a bad person, It's much more noble for you to be an entrepreneur who started from nothing and built your business up like the American dream. That's the good guy. That's always the type of person you want to be. And if you had a trust fund and you were a rich guy because your dad handed you down cash, that's a symbol almost by default that you're a bad person, that nobody should like you, that you're infinitely arrogant, that you can't really achieve anything good, that you cannot have any noble traits. Now, of course, 200, 300 years ago, the entire infrastructure of the Western upper class was to make sure that their children did not have to work excessively trying to build up their wealth. Instead, what they were trying to do is create these systems of generational wealth so that they could provide this massive platform for their children and grandchildren to pursue high aims, such as being a warrior knight or an aristocrat or something like this, or chasing after high political aims, or being a scientist, or being an artist. The whole thinking was that you actually want to provide your children with like an incredible amount of stability so that they can have a future. You wanted them to be a trust fund baby because that's the way that you guarantee that they can not have to be tethered down to hard work and the kind of slop of labor, and instead be free to do these incredible things like create science and create high art. Now, that difference in thinking is monumental when you really ponder about what it means. Or what about our attitude towards health and breeding and genetics? In a very similar way that you would want your aristocratic parents to create a big trust fund for you so you could run off and become an artist or discover some type of scientific theorem. You also want your parents to gift you a good batch of genetics. You want them to gift you something that makes you naturally beautiful, because that's going to make everything in your life better and easier as a consequence. But of course, we hate this idea. Any idea that your genetics is something that we should obey, anything that's restrictive and fixed like that, in Western culture, we consider that a bad thing, because it means that those people who are born not good enough, those people who are born genetically botched, genetically weak, that means that their stories are abysmal. And we want to look at the world through their eyes. We want to pull ourselves down and say, well, okay, all right, why do you want to focus? Why do you want to celebrate something like genetics or health or beauty or success, natural beauty or natural success? Why do you want to celebrate something like that? Because there's lots of people who don't have those things for a variety of different reasons. And it's demoralizing for them to live in a culture that celebrates those things. We want those people who don't have those things to feel motivated, to feel that the world is built for them, to feel that they can transform their situation, because this is what we care about. This is what we want to see. We want to reward them. We don't want to leave them out of the whole game. Now, this is again a problem, because then the people who have good genetic stock, who have a good reservoir of genetics that are getting passed down through the generations, this means that their way of processing and thinking of things gets demoralized, because the way that genetics work is again quite generational. It's quite long term. You can't really change your genetics as an individual, no matter how heroic you are. In fact, it requires a way different style of thinking that's very, very fascinating, where you have to think more long term if you want to develop good genetic stock. If you want to make your grandchildren have the blessing of great genetics, you have to work really hard in this life to get a really beautiful girlfriend, and then you have to work really hard to raise a really competent sons and really beautiful daughters, so that they get really beautiful partners, so that the process continues on down the line. And this stuff, people hear about this type of stuff and they're like, first of all, it's just such long-term thinking that people aren't used to doing. It's scary to people because they think, oh my God, it's you know, it's authoritarian, it's raising standards, all these types of things. Our culture does not like looking at the world from this perspective. We do not like validating these types of attitudes. We do not like thinking about beauty, the long-term processes of building beauty. We do not like thinking about like the experience that Chad has of being well raised, of the jock showing up and being athletically gifted, of the great sacrifices and stresses his parents had to go through in order to provide him that type of life. Instead, we want to focus on the story of the loser. We frame all that type of thinking of hereditary success and stuff like this, the jock style success. We frame all that stuff as fundamentally evil. We say that those people are in the Illuminati. They're these crazy, greedy, generationally evil thieves that are trying to take over the world as Satanists and stuff like this. We talk about the families that run the world and all this. And instead we want to pedestalize. We want to celebrate the perspective, the experience of the loser, the person who has to build themselves out of nothing. Perhaps that's because an awful lot of us who realize the nature of the world actually come from that perspective, so it's the one that we identify with. But of course, there is other ways of seeing things. Say, for example, you were to use the gift of your imaginative empathy and try to see the world from the perspective of the jock, or from the perspective of a family that can produce the jock, and the long generational process that went into doing that. You know what you're starting to do there? You're starting to think like a winner. You're starting to think like someone who's playing the game at the highest level. You're moving yourself up the chessboard. You're no longer going to be a pawn, but now you're turning into a king or a rook or a queen or something like this. Maybe you can be the queen, I'll be the king. How about that? Now, when you start to take this perspective, the way that the jock sees things, or the hereditary family or the upper class family begins to see things, the conquerors, the masters, the people who run stuff, the people who win generationally, how do you start seeing the world differently? How does the loser appear to you? What's this phenomenon of the loser like? Well, what you'll see actually these very impulsive and emotional people show up. Their families don't invest very, very long term to make their children beautiful. They develop all sorts of bad habits like drinking too much, smoking too much, bad monetary habits, gambling. They have all sorts of vices that pull them down into the lower echelons of society and the poverty traps and stuff like this. And as a consequence of this, they struggle to set their children up over the long term. And so the experience of these characters is that these losers show up every generation and they're complaining, they're jaded, they're resentful, they hate you. They think that you're a bad person and stuff like this. They think that they call you like the Illuminati, or they say that you're some type of negative bully and all these types of things. But they're showing up fetal alcohol syndrome, they're botched, their genetic stock is not that great. All these vices are compounding into you turning into these sort of like gremlins or orcs that are showing up in their world. And they don't actually really hate you that much. They just kind of find you a little bit dishonest, a little bit insincere. They can kind of see that over the generations you constantly make the wrong choices and you're not sincere and honest enough to criticize yourself and turn around and say, okay, my family and what we are making bad choices. We should try to change our situation here and try to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps and become more disciplined and transform the situation that we have going on and set up a long-term plan to make sure that we become winners. They don't see you having that type of self-criticism. Instead you just lie to yourself. You come up with rationalizations. You say that, the jocks are all Satanists or evil or bullies. You resent them and you go back to the gambling house, the casino, or you go drinking, or you go to the sports betting or something like this. And they see these types of rationalizations. They start to view the underclasses, view you liars and losers as liars, as untruthful. Their perspective on you is very negative, just in a different way. And you can see the clash then of these two attitudes. Now, as we're evolving this idea, we're moving away from the jock and the nerd, these individuals, and we're starting to understand how this idea by Nietzsche, this psychological observation, is so profound because it scales beyond individuals into groups, into tribes, into what we're talking about here, classes or castes. We have the upper caste who runs the matrix, the people who work hereditarily, they plan long term, they set up strong families that push society forward and have elite networks of people working together. They all go to their private schools and they network together and get everything working together. They work among themselves. They understand the values that it takes to win. And their culture is highly focused on promoting these values. They're very focused on things like education. They're focused on keeping power concentrated among themselves. They understand how to do finance in a way that they don't pay as much taxes as it might seem on paper and stuff like this. They play the game so that they win and so they can keep building up repositories of health and success, good genetics, good ownership infrastructure, these types of things. A very sophisticated way of approaching things. And their attitude is a winning attitude. They're disciplined. They're focused on putting everything together quite well. They're focused on producing jocks. And they see the underclass, the angry, cranky plebs, as people who have bad values and bad virtues that leads to them losing. And this underclass, these people who feel trapped by the matrix, they're in some sense their own worst enemy. They are down there covered in all sorts of dishonesty and vices that get them trapped in that perspective. And these upper class people disrespect them. They don't see them as having values. This is the relationship between a master and a slave. Of course, you flip that on its head and the plebs see themselves as these people who are oppressed randomly by these evil jocks who are just trying to get along in life, and who they see these jocks as arrogant, as insular, as selfish, as exploitative, as sort of evil and negative and stuff like this. They have a very, very negative attitude towards them. And maybe in some sense it could be true. Maybe these masters are being exploitative. They have every opportunity with all the power that they have to do stuff like that. So the plebs might be correct. Nonetheless, this is the fundamental relationship between these two categories, these two classes. Now, of course, Nietzsche began to see this stuff back in his day, and so he did what he does best. He did an analysis of classical literature in ancient Greece, and he actually discovered this exact same phenomenon in ancient Greece. In the start of Genealogy of Morals, he talks about how the aristocracy of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and various other tribes in Europe would have the perspective of this upper class set of masters, and the value system, the way that they understood what is good and right and what is a virtue and what is a bad trait and a good trait, was representative of how these types of people saw themselves. He specifically looked at language and the way that that comes across in their literature. So if you want to understand this, think about how we nowadays call people in the upper class the elite, or the 1%, or the rich. These language categories are ways that we identify these people. Now, back then in ancient Greece, they had their way of saying this as well. But the Greeks, in a very fascinating way, would call themselves not the rich or the elite per se, but call themselves the truthful, the reality, the realists, the people in a line with the real world. And they would call the underclasses the liars, the deceivers. The poor were considered the people who are dishonest. He points out that he sees this in German as well. The German word bad is got this linguistic echo, he believes, to the German word for simple or rude or vulgar or peasant-like, which is schlicht. Now, the thing that you must stress and understand here is how much this is different to how we normally, in our culture, understand what is good and bad. Because we identify with the victim so much, the loser, the downtrodden, the lowly, because we see things through the eyes of the peasants in our mass democracies, we tend to categorize these people, these noble classes, these upper classes, we categorize them as evil. When we think of bad in our culture, and the stories we tend to tell ourselves are not centered around noticing how the poor, the people who struggle, the downtrodden, have a tendency to lie to themselves and rationalize excuses for why they don't take the correct actions, which leads them to not being noble as a first principle. Instead, the stories that we tell are more about demonizing nobility, demonizing people at the top, demonizing people that are conquering. So the things that we consider bad, or more specifically evil, are things like power. Because of course these upper classes have power and the peasants do not. And so we can say that these upper classes are bullies, that they are driven psychopathic by the power that they have gained. They're crazy guys who just love power. They're all Saurons up there, and they're just running around planning ways like the Sith Lord that they can crush us and destroy us. Everything about them is never given its due perspective. It's never steelmanned. Instead, it's always just categorized as evil. Draco Malfoy, a representative of an upper class person, is from a blue blood who doesn't have any mudblood distortions. He's got a father who's an hereditary wizard. He is a spoilt, arrogant little brat who has a big team of people around him, just like the jocks. He is framed entirely in a bad way, and Harry Potter is the underclass pleb who comes from the suburbs, who is kind of mixed mudblood, and he's not really from this pure line, but he's talented and he's special and all these types of things. That whole story is framed in this perspective. Voldemort is a hereditary power lord who's just psychopathically wants to hurt Harry for no apparent reason whatsoever, just that he's driven mad by the idea of power and order. And when you begin to notice this, you start seeing it everywhere. The villains in so much of our popular culture are categorized as evil because they have these traits and these habits. Now, why is this not necessarily a good thing? You see, if you wanted to win, you should probably model your perspective on winners, not on losers. If you were able to break out of your social conditioning and begin to see how these people think, these masters think, you would realize that they hold education to a high standard. They're focused on networking, on discipline, on long-term thinking. These are all fantastic traits. You'd begin to see the impulsiveness of much of your culture. You'd begin to realize that an awful lot of the culture that the mass mainstream people gobble up is pig slop that they choose because it's an easy thing to think, but actually keeps them imprisoned. You could change your destiny and the destiny of your great-grandchildren by just making one choice in the way that you begin to think. And so now you can probably see how toxic this loser mentality is. All these stories trying to convince you that it's okay to make all these rationalizations about why you're a fucking loser with no impulse control. And all these rationalizations about why the people who succeed, all the traits that could change your situation, are evil and you should hate them outright. You can see how that keeps you trapped, can't you? And now that your eyes are open to this, you will soon see that this problem is not some self-improvement titbit, but it sits at the core of Western culture. And that's what we'll explore next time.